There's a quiet kind of strength in mothers the world often overlooks. People will celebrate a man who builds a company or a general who wins a war. But a woman who holds two jobs, pays the bills, and still manages to keep her children fed, clothed, and loved, her victories are too ordinary to make the evening news. Yet those small triumphs are often what keep families alive. Angela Robinson had lived her life in the shadows of such unrecognized triumphs. At 52, she was not a woman anyone would stop on the street. She carried herself with the weariness of years, her shoulders slightly bent as if still bearing the weight of her late husband's coffin. Her hands, dark-skinned and roughened from endless shifts, bore the story of sacrifice in each line and scar. Angela was a widow. Her husband, Thomas, had died 10 years earlier in a construction accident on a site outside Atlanta. It had been sudden, brutal. One moment, she was folding laundry in their small living room. The next, a phone call told her the man she had shared 22 years with would never walk through the door again. In the beginning, grief was an ocean that nearly drowned her. But children do not let their parents sink for long. Marcus, then 15, and Jasmine, only 8, still needed dinners cooked, homework checked, lights kept on. Angela found herself working as a hotel maid by day, a cafeteria worker in the evenings, and sometimes cleaning offices overnight. Exhaustion became her companion, but so did resilience. Her children became her reason. Everything Angela did was for them. She wanted Marcus to become the first man in their family to graduate college. She wanted Jasmine to feel that, despite their lack of wealth, she could step into the world with dignity. For years, Angela reminded herself of one truth. As long as her children had a home, they would have a chance. The house she lived in was nothing grand, 2 bedrooms, a cramped kitchen, peeling paint on the porch, but it was hers and Thomas's. Paid for through years of overtime and Thomas's careful saving before he died. It was the one thing that tethered Angela to a sense of stability. She often said, "This house is my promise to you," and both Marcus and Jasmine knew what she meant. But life has a cruel way of testing promises. Angela's in-laws, Thomas's family, never made things easier. They saw her as a burden after his death, a woman who could not possibly manage on her own. Patricia, Thomas's younger sister, was particularly harsh. At family gatherings, she would whisper loud enough for Angela to hear, "Poor Angie, barely hanging on. I bet she'll lose that house one day." These words stung, but Angela swallowed her pride. Better to endure humiliation than let her children see her crumble. By the time Angela turned 52, her daughter Jasmine had just graduated high school with dreams of going to Spelman College. Marcus, now 25, was no longer the boy who cried at his father's funeral. He was a man, broad-shouldered and ambitious. But ambition, Angela was beginning to realize, can be both a blessing and a curse. Marcus had grown restless. Watching his mother scrub floors for pennies had filled him with shame he couldn't voice. He wanted to rise above, to prove that the Robinson name could mean more than struggle. He started talking about investments, cryptocurrency, real estate flips, startups. Angela tried to listen, though half the words sounded foreign to her. She urged caution, reminding him that fast money often leaves faster than it comes. Marcus would smile, kiss her cheek, and say, "Don't worry, Mom, I got this." And Angela, tired from 12-hour shifts, wanted so badly to believe him. The night the truth revealed itself began like any other. Angela was folding laundry at the kitchen table, the television murmuring in the background, Jasmine upstairs humming to herself. A thin envelope sat among the day's mail. Angela almost tossed it aside, thinking it was another credit card offer. But the return address caught her eye, Fulton County Bank. Her stomach tightened. She opened the letter with careful fingers. "Final notice," it began, her eyes blurred as she scanned the page. The words slammed into her chest, defaulted loan, overdue payments, foreclosure proceedings. The amount listed was staggering, tens of thousands of dollars. Angela sat frozen, the dryer still buzzing in the background. The letter was addressed not just to Marcus Robinson, but to Marcus Robinson and Angela Robinson. Her name, her house, her home. She felt as if the floor had given way beneath her. "Marcus," she called, her voice sharp. He emerged from his room upstairs, phone in hand, wearing the guilty face of a child caught sneaking cookies. "What is this?" Angela demanded, shoving the letter at him. Her hands shook so violently that the paper rattled. Marcus read it, sighed heavily, and pressed his palm against his forehead. "Mom, I can explain." "Explain? You put my house, our house, on the line for some scheme?" Her voice cracked under the weight of betrayal. Marcus tried to reach for her hand. "It wasn't like that. I had a chance, Mom, a real chance. My buddy told me about this investment." "Investment?" Angela spat the word as if it burned her tongue. "You gambled with the only thing keeping this family together. Your father died building this home for us. And you," her throat closed around the rest. Silence stretched between them, broken only by Jasmine's hesitant footsteps on the stairs. She stood halfway down, eyes wide. "Mom, Marcus, what's going on?" Angela turned to her daughter, her face a mask of pain she could no longer hide. "Your brother," she said, her voice trembling, "has put our home at risk. Everything we've worked for, everything we've survived for." Jasmine gasped, her hand covering her mouth. Marcus dropped his gaze to the floor, ashamed. In that moment, Angela Robinson, a woman who had survived widowhood, poverty, and ridicule, felt truly abandoned, not by death this time, but by the son she had given everything to save. And as the night pressed on, she realized the cruelest truth of all. Sometimes, betrayal does not come from strangers or in-laws or the world outside. Sometimes, it comes from the very child you've sacrificed your life to protect. Angela barely slept that night. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her modest bedroom, listening to the steady tick of the clock on the wall. Every sound in the house felt amplified, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards as Jasmine shifted in her room, even Marcus's footsteps pacing upstairs. When dawn broke, she rose with heavy limbs and prepared for another long day of work. Yet all through her morning shift at the hotel, the letter gnawed at her. Each room she cleaned, each bed she tucked tight, the words replayed in her head. "Foreclosure proceedings, joint liability, your property may be seized." By the time she returned home that evening, a storm had already gathered inside her. She wanted answers. But she also knew Marcus. If she attacked him with nothing but rage, he would retreat, defend, lash out. And so she decided on something else. She would make dinner, the way she had done countless times before, and hope the familiarity of the ritual might lead to honesty. Angela cooked with trembling hands. She roasted chicken, seasoned collard greens, mashed sweet potatoes the way Marcus liked. The smells filled the small kitchen with warmth, masking the chill in her heart. She set the table carefully, smoothing the old linen cloth her mother had given her years ago. The good plates came out, even if one had a chip on the rim. She wanted tonight to feel like family, though the word had started to taste bitter. At 7 sharp, Jasmine appeared first, fresh from her part-time job at the bookstore. She was still in her apron, her curly hair tied up in a messy bun. "Smells good, Mama," she said, placing her bag by the door. Angela forced a smile. Marcus came last. He wore a pressed shirt as if trying to look older, more successful, though the exhaustion in his eyes betrayed him. He slipped into his chair, avoiding Angela's gaze. The meal began quietly. Forks scraped against plates. Jasmine chatted about a new novel arriving at the store, something about a girl leaving her small town to chase dreams. Angela nodded, but her mind wasn't in the story. Her eyes kept drifting to Marcus, who shoveled food without tasting it. Finally, Angela set her fork down. "Marcus," she said softly, We need to talk about what I found yesterday. The clatter of Jasmine's fork against her plate filled the silence. Marcus froze, his jaw tightening. "Not now, Mom," he muttered. "Yes, now," Angela replied, her voice firmer. "You signed my name to a loan. You risked our house. You lied." Marcus's head snapped up, his eyes flashing. "I didn't lie. I was trying to help us, to help you." "Help me?" Angela's laugh was bitter, hollow. "By putting me on the street? By gambling with the only thing we have?" Jasmine glanced between them, her face pale. "Marcus, is it true? You signed something with Mom's name?" He pushed his plate away, leaning forward. "I had a plan, okay. There was this real estate project. My friend had an in. He said we'd double our money in 6 months. I thought if it worked, I could pay off the loan and finally give Mom the life she deserves." "The life I deserve." Angela's voice rose, raw with years of exhaustion. "Marcus, the life I deserve is one where I can sleep at night knowing my children aren't dragging me into ruin." Jasmine reached across the table, touching Angela's hand. "Mama, calm down, please." But Angela's eyes filled with tears she could no longer hold back. "Do you know how many years I worked so you two could eat? How many nights I mopped floors while you slept safe in that bed? And you," her voice broke. She pressed a fist to her chest. "You used the one thing your father left us as a lottery ticket." Marcus slammed his fist on the table, rattling the plates. "I'm tired of being poor, Mom. I'm tired of watching you break your back for pennies. I wanted to change things, but you never believe in me. You just see failure before I even begin." The words cut deeper than he knew. Angela's lips trembled. She saw Thomas's face in her son's anger, the same furrowed brow, the same fire. But Thomas had worked with his hands, sweat, and blood, never once risking what he couldn't afford to lose. "Don't you dare put this on me," Angela whispered. "Don't you dare." The room was thick with silence. Jasmine's eyes burned with tears, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Marcus, you should be ashamed. Mom has carried us since Dad died. Everything we are, everything we have, is because of her." Marcus turned to his sister, stung. "Easy for you to say. You've got scholarships, your whole life ahead of you. You don't know what it's like to be the man of the house." Angela pushed back her chair, the legs scraping hard against the floor. "You don't get to call yourself the man of this house if you can't protect it. Being a man doesn't mean making reckless choices. It means standing tall when it's hard. It means honesty." Marcus rose too, his chair toppling. His voice cracked with anger and shame. "You'll never understand me. You'll never see that I was trying." And then he stormed from the table, the front door slamming behind him. The house shook with the echo. Angela sank back into her chair, her body trembling. Jasmine slipped beside her, wrapping thin arms around her mother's shoulders. "It's okay, Mama," she whispered. "We'll figure this out. I'm not going anywhere." Angela clung to her daughter, the scent of Jasmine's shampoo mixing with the food gone cold on the table. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of true defeat pressing down. Her son had chosen pride over truth, and in doing so had placed them all on the edge of ruin. The table before them, once a symbol of family, now looked broken, food untouched, plates rattled, napkins crumpled. It was not just dinner that had collapsed. Something deeper had cracked, something that might never be mended. And in that dim, quiet room, Angela Robinson realized that the fight for her home would not be only against banks or signatures on paper. It would be against her own blood. The house was quiet after Marcus slammed the door, but it was not the kind of quiet that soothes. It was the kind that lingers like smoke after a fire, acrid and choking. The chicken sat untouched, the collard greens grown limp, the sweet potatoes cooling into lumps of starch. Angela stared at the table as if it were a battlefield, plates the fallen soldiers of a war she never wanted. Jasmine stayed beside her, holding her mother's hand long after the sound of Marcus's car faded into the distance. Neither spoke. Sometimes silence is its own kind of comfort, a way of saying, "I know you're hurting and I'm here." Eventually, Angela pulled herself together, wiped her eyes, and sent Jasmine upstairs. "Go on, baby. You've got that shift at the bookstore tomorrow. Try to get some rest." Jasmine hesitated. "Mama, I'll be fine," Angela said, forcing a smile that fooled no one. But Jasmine kissed her cheek and obeyed. When the house was finally still, Angela rose from the table and walked to her bedroom. She opened the drawer of the old oak desk Thomas had bought at a yard sale years ago. It was where she kept bills, insurance papers, and the deed to the house, their history written in contracts and ink. She had to know exactly what Marcus had done. Her fingers trembled as she sorted through the envelopes until she found a thick folder marked property records. Inside, alongside the original deed, lay a set of bank statements she had never seen before. The papers were crisp, newer, their pages heavy with the weight of deceit. Angela sat down heavily on the bed, scanning the first page. The loan balance stared back at her. $72,000. Collateral: house at 214 Peachtree Lane. Borrower: Marcus Robinson. Co-signer: Angela Robinson. Her name was written there, bold and clear, only it wasn't her hand. She had signed enough documents in her life to know what her own signature looked like. This one was smooth, practiced, but it was not hers. Angela pressed the paper against her chest, her breathing ragged. Marcus hadn't just borrowed money, he had forged her name. Her first thought was disbelief. The boy she had carried in her arms, who used to fall asleep on her shoulder after backyard baseball games, who once slipped her a handmade Mother's Day card saying, "You're my hero, Mom," that boy had done this. Her second thought was fear. If the bank decided to pursue the debt, they wouldn't care whose hand signed the papers. Her name was there. Her home was at stake. And then came the third thought, the one that hit her like a hammer. She had been alone for far too long. She had carried the weight of this family by herself, and now even her son had turned into another weight pressing her down. She needed someone. Angela picked up her phone and scrolled through the contacts until she found the one she trusted most, Monica James. They had known each other since their 20s, when they worked side by side as janitors in a downtown office building. Over the years, Monica had become more than a friend. She was a sister, a confidante, the one person Angela knew she could call at any hour. When Monica answered, her voice was warm, steady. "Angela, you sound like you've been crying." Angela swallowed hard. "It's Marcus," she whispered. "He's put us in debt, a loan against the house." A pause, then Monica's voice sharpened. "What do you mean? Against the house?" Angela explained, her words tumbling over each other, the letter from the bank, the dinner table fight, the papers in her drawer, the signature that wasn't hers. When she finished, there was silence on the line, broken only by Monica's long, slow exhale. "Lord have mercy," she said finally. "Angela, listen to me. This is serious. Forgery, that's a crime, and if the bank pushes, you could lose everything." "I know," Angela said, her voice cracking. "I just don't understand how my own child could do this to me, to us." "Baby, Marcus is drowning," Monica replied gently. "And when people are desperate, they grab onto whatever keeps them afloat, even if it pulls someone else under. You can't fix his choices, but you can protect yourself." Angela closed her eyes, protect herself. The words felt foreign. For years, her every thought had been about protecting Marcus and Jasmine, even if it meant sacrificing her own needs. Could she really put herself first now? "I don't even know where to start," she admitted. "You start," Monica said firmly, "by getting those documents looked at. Don't wait until the sheriff shows up at your door, and you need to think about boundaries, Angela. Marcus is a grown man, you've raised him, you've done your part. This mess, it's not on you to clean up." Angela's throat tightened with emotion. She wanted to believe Monica. She wanted to believe she could still save herself. After they hung up, Angela sat in the quiet, the folder still in her lap. She remembered Thomas's voice, deep and steady, telling her on the night they signed the deed, "No matter what happens, Angie, this house will be yours, a place for you and the kids, a place no one can take away." And yet, someone had tried, someone she had given birth to. The ache in her chest deepened, but beneath it stirred something else, something small, fragile, but alive. Anger, yes, but also resolve. Angela Robinson had been underestimated her entire life, by her in-laws, by strangers, even by herself. But if there was one thing she knew after 52 years, it was this: when the world tries to take away everything you love, you fight. You fight with whatever you've got. As she placed the folder back in the drawer, a plan began to form, though it was hazy and full of fear. She would not let Marcus's mistake become her downfall. She would not let Patricia and the rest of her husband's family gloat that the widow had finally lost. She would not let Thomas's promise die. Angela stood, straightened her shoulders, and whispered into the empty room, "Not this house. Not my home. Not yet." Morning came gray and heavy, the kind of Atlanta sky that makes the magnolia leaves look lacquered and the porches lean into their shadows. Angela stood at the kitchen sink, staring through the window at the narrow yard where Thomas used to set a grill on summer Saturdays. The ash-stained spot in the dirt was still there, small, stubborn, honest. She held a coffee mug without tasting a sip, her thoughts circling the drawer where the forged signature slept like a snake. She had always believed family was the place your hurt could rest without judgment. But the older she got, the more she learned that family could be the place where hurt learned to run. The doorbell rang. Angela didn't need to check the peephole. Some bells carry personality. This one was impatient, drilled, like it owned the house and was reminding the occupant of that fact. She set the mug down, wiped her hands on a dish towel, and opened the door. Patricia stood on the stoop in a power blazer the color of new money, a leather bag tucked under an elbow like a file of evidence. She wore perfume that announced itself a half step before she did. Behind her, the street hummed with weekday life. A delivery van idling, a neighbor dragging a trash bin, a pair of kids biking in lazy loops. "Angie," Patricia said, lifting her chin in a way that made the nickname sound like a demotion. "We need to talk." Angela held the door frame as a balance bar. "Then talk." Patricia's smile was small and razor-thin. "I'll come in." "No, you won't. Say what you came to say." They stood like that, two women, one blood by law, one blood by heart, on either side of a threshold that had seen birthday candles and funeral casseroles, and now this, a negotiation over dignity. Patricia sighed in theatrical surrender. "Fine, I'll be brief. We're concerned about Marcus." "We?" Angela asked. "The family," Patricia said, and the word arrived wearing an ill-fitting crown. "After Thomas passed, we all agreed we'd look out for you and the children." Angela let the lie pass like a bad odor. "Marcus will answer for his choices." "Will he?" Patricia pulled a folder from her bag. "Because what I hear is he's in trouble with a loan he can't cover. And I also hear the bank is eager to take this place if the payments aren't made. We cannot have Marcus ruined by one mistake. We cannot have Marcus ruined." The sentence slid a quiet blade, no mention of Angela's ruin, of Jasmine's, of the roof itself. "I'm not discussing my home on the porch," Angela said, trying to keep her voice from splitting. "And I'm not discussing my son with someone who calls him we only when it's convenient." Patricia's eyes froze. "I'm offering a solution. There's a buyer, cash. I know the agent. We sell quickly, settle the debt, and with the remainder—" "Remainder?" Angela's laugh was small and sick. "You plan the leftovers of my life like the scraps after a cookout." Patricia leaned closer. The perfume grew louder. "Angela, listen to me. You are drowning. Marcus is drowning. Let the people who can swim help. You can rent something smaller, convenient, near a bus line. And when the dust settles, maybe there will be enough for Jasmine's textbooks. Lord knows that girl will need help if she goes to Spelman or whatever fantasy she's written in her notebook." There it was, the sweetened barb, sugar on the rim of insult. Angela felt heat rise in her. Jasmine's dreams aren't up for your appraisal. Everything is up for appraisal when there's debt, Patricia said. That's how the world works. You of all people should know that. Thomas knew it, and he would have wanted us to step in. Angela met her sister-in-law's gaze and for a breath saw past the lacquer. The child Patricia once was, maybe scolded for untidiness, the young woman who learned that control is the only version of safety some people are offered. Pity threatened to soften Angela's anger, but pity is a poor wall against a bulldozer. Thomas wanted this house to be mine, Angela said quietly. His words, his promise. Patricia's lips thinned. She slid a paper from her folder and held it up. Promises don't pay lenders. This, she shook the page, pays lenders. Angela didn't reach for the paper. She recognized the bank's letterhead, the red-banded final notice across the top, the legal italics that made human lives look like footnotes. She also recognized the trap. Accept the paper, accept the frame of the conversation. I know what's in there, Angela said. I was there when the mail came. I was there when the child I raised told me he'd staked our home on a shortcut around hard work. Patricia clucked her tongue. Marcus is a good boy, he's just ambitious. So was a storm that tore half the shingles off this roof in 09. Angela said, ambition doesn't excuse damage, it describes the wind. Angela began to close the door, but Patricia wedged her palm against it, the polite version of a shove. If you keep this house, you will lose it. If you sell now, we control the loss. And I'll see to it you get something for your trouble. I know people. I can make calls. You can make calls, Angela repeated. And what do I owe you then? Patricia's smile returned, the blade resheathed. Family doesn't keep a ledger. Angela thought of every ledger she had kept on scratch pads and the back of envelopes of rent due and light bill, of overtime hours and grocery lists and shoes bought one at a time, a left in September and a right come Christmas. She thought of the ledger hiding in the drawer, the one with a false signature, a son's desperation written in a stranger's hand. Family, Angela said, is not a ledger until a house is involved. Then everybody shows up with a calculator. From the corner of her eye, Angela saw Jasmine on the stairs, still in pajamas, watching, silent, absorbing. She straightened. We're done here, she said to Patricia. Tell your buyer to look elsewhere. Tell your agent to lose my number. And tell the family we are not a broken table waiting for their glue. Patricia's veneer cracked. You're being stubborn, prideful. Do you think anyone will look after you when this goes bad? You think this neighborhood will start a GoFundMe because you made a sentimental choice? I'm offering you a lifeline. You're offering me your rope tied to my neck, Angela said, voice low. Take your folder, take your perfume, take your plans for my life and spend them on someone who asked. Don't say I didn't try. Patricia stepped back, smoothing her blazer as if brushing off lint. When the bank comes, and it will, don't call us. Angela closed the door gently, the way a nurse closes a curtain around a sleeping patient, not cruel, just final. She leaned her forehead against the wood and let out a breath she'd been holding since Thomas died, or maybe since she was born into a world that asked women like her to make miracles from coupons and quiet. Jasmine came down the last steps, barefoot, soft. You okay, Mama? I'm tired, Angela said, but I'm not broken. They sat at the kitchen table because that's where people sit when they are telling the truth. Sun pushed past the clouds and laid a pale ribbon of light across the old table's scars. Jasmine reached for Angela's hand. What are we going to do? Jasmine asked. We're going to get help, Angela said, saying it made the air move easier in her lungs. From people who see us as more than numbers, I'm calling Miss Monica again. And then, she hesitated, as if stepping onto a bridge she couldn't fully see. And then I'm going to the bank and to a lawyer if I have to. We're going to put this house in a fortress of paper, No more open windows for storms to crawl through. Jasmine nodded, her eyes bright. I'll work more shifts. I can delay buying those campus books. I'll print PDFs, borrow, hustle, whatever it takes. Angela squeezed her daughter's hand. You will not shrink your future to pay for someone else's mistake. Your father wanted you to walk through a door we never found. You're still walking. Jasmine's smile was small and brave. Okay. They spent the next hour gathering documents. The deed, the insurance papers, tax returns, the bank letters, even the yellowing receipts Thomas kept in a cigar box because men of his generation thought paper proved existence. Angela placed everything in a neat stack, then added a sticky note with her own handwriting. Not this house. Not this time. The phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number flashed. Hi, Angela. This is Susan with True Point Realty. Heard you might be considering selling 214 Peachtree. Cash buyer interested. Could close in 14 days. Call me, a winky emoji, as if homes were flirtations. Angela let the message sit in its little blue bubble, a mosquito she refused to slap just to get blood on her hand. She powered the phone down, the silence now hers again. By noon, she had changed into her church dress, the navy one that made her feel addressed by her own reflection, and pulled her hair back with careful hands. She looked at herself in the mirror, saw the years and the miles inside the years. She saw a woman people mistook for fragile because she was polite. She saw a woman who had learned not to confuse politeness with permission. Ready? Jasmine asked from the doorway. As I'll ever be, Angela said. They stepped onto the porch. The magnolia leaves shone. Across the street, the neighbor who dragged the trash bin earlier lifted a hand in greeting, eyes curious, kind. Angela locked the door. For the first time since the letter arrived, the click didn't sound like an ending. It sounded like a promise kept. On the way down the steps, they passed the spot where Thomas's grill used to stand. Angela paused. Baby, she said to Jasmine, do you remember how your daddy would always wait until the charcoal was perfect? He'd say, you rush a fire, you ruin the meat. Jasmine smiled. He said it every time. Angela nodded. We won't rush this fire. They walked to the bus stop, papers tucked into a folder clutched against Angela's ribs, a shield made of ink and memory. When the bus arrived, they climbed aboard and took seats beside a window. As the neighborhood slid past, the corner store, the barber shop, the woman who sold boiled peanuts from a cart, Angela felt something rise in her, a tide that wasn't grief or panic but a steadier current. Fight, it whispered, with whatever you've got. 3 stops before downtown, Angela's phone turned back on to check a route, lit with an incoming call from Monica. I found someone, Monica said without preamble. A lawyer, good one, and before you say you can't afford it, hush, he owes me a favor. Angela closed her eyes and let the relief wash over her system in a small, warm wave. Thank you. One more thing, Monica added. There's a banker I trust. She's decent. She'll tell you what the bank can and can't do. You're not walking into wolves without a map. Angela opened her eyes. The bus braked. A woman climbed aboard with a baby on her hip and a diaper bag slung like a saddle. The child laughed at nothing and everything. There are still sounds in the world that make hearts remember how to beat properly. Text me the addresses, Angela said. We're on our way. She hung up and turned to Jasmine. You ready for a civics lesson nobody teaches at school? Always, Jasmine said. They smiled at each other, tired, defiant, related not only by blood, but by a shared refusal to surrender. Outside, downtown grew taller, glass and steel catching what light the day offered. Angela adjusted her grip on the folder. Inside were proofs of a life built, threatened, defended. Outside was a family who would try again to call her a burden. In between was a woman who knew, finally, that burdens sometimes carry themselves. The bus hissed to a stop. Angela rose. Come on, baby, she said. Let's make some people remember my name is on that deed. By the time Angela and Jasmine returned from their meeting downtown, the day had bled into evening. The streetlights blinked awake as they walked up Peachtree Lane, each lamp buzzing faintly like it was uncertain of its own strength. Angela carried the folder tighter than ever, her grip a declaration. This house is not yet lost, but the fight left her weary. That night, after Jasmine had gone to bed, Angela sat in the living room with the television on mute, watching shadows play across the ceiling. Patricia's words echoed in her mind, ugly as a curse, "You are drowning. Let the people who can swim help." The truth was, Angela had been swimming for more than a decade, and now her arms ached. The following morning, Angela reported to her shift at the Regal Midtown Hotel, where she worked as a housekeeper. The job was repetitive: bedsheets, vacuum, restock towels, but there was a comfort in its predictability. Life, for Angela, had become a series of routines stitched together with the hope that her children's future would look nothing like her present. She pushed her cart into room 1610, a corner suite that smelled faintly of cigar smoke and expensive cologne. The curtains were drawn, muting the city view. Angela began her ritual: strip the bed, gather glasses, empty the trash. But then, a sound. A sharp thud, followed by a muffled groan. Angela froze. Her hands hovered over the pillows, her heart quickening. She followed the noise into the adjoining sitting room and found a man collapsed near the balcony doors, his body half-turned, one hand clutching his chest. "Lord, have mercy," she whispered, rushing to his side. "Sir, can you hear me?" The man's face was pale, his lips tinged blue. He tried to speak, but only a faint gasp emerged. Without hesitation, Angela grabbed the phone on the desk and dialed the front desk. Her voice was steady despite her racing pulse. "This is room 1610. Guest emergency. Call an ambulance, now." She knelt back down, loosening his tie, raising his head gently with a folded towel. Years of watching health videos at church first aid classes had prepared her for this moment more than she realized. She whispered softly, the way she used to when Marcus had nightmares as a boy. "Hold on, sir. Help is coming. Stay with me." Minutes later, paramedics arrived, lifting the man onto a stretcher. Before they wheeled him out, his eyes fluttered open just long enough to find Angela's face. A whisper, ragged and thin, escaped him. "Thank you." 2 days later, as Angela finished her shift, the hotel manager called her into the office. "Room 1610 guest wants to see you," he said. Angela's brow furrowed. "Why?" "He insists, says you saved his life." Angela hesitated but followed the manager to the suite. When the door opened, the man from the other day was standing there, upright, dressed in a tailored navy suit. His complexion was still pale, but his eyes were sharp, commanding. "Mrs. Robinson?" His voice was warm with the faint rasp of recovery. Angela nodded. "Yes, sir, I'm glad you're all right." He extended his hand. "William Carter." The name stirred faint recognition. Angela had seen it in headlines: real estate magnate, philanthropist, one of Atlanta's wealthiest men. He smiled faintly, as though amused by her realization. "I wanted to thank you in person," he said. "The doctors told me another 10 minutes and I might not have made it. You gave me those minutes." Angela shifted uncomfortably, unused to such attention. "I just did what anyone would have done." "No," William replied, his gaze steady. "Not anyone. Many would have panicked or walked away. You stayed, you helped." Angela flushed, unused to praise. "Well, I'm just glad you're better." William studied her for a moment. "Tell me about yourself, Mrs. Robinson. Do you have family?" Angela hesitated, then gave the simplest version of her truth. "I'm a widow. I've raised 2 children on my own. My daughter's just graduated. My son," her voice faltered, but she steadied it. "My son's finding his way." Something in her tone must have revealed more than she intended, because William's eyes softened. "You've carried a great deal." Angela managed a small smile. "Mothers do. There was a pause, the kind that stretches not with awkwardness but with the weight of something unspoken. Then William said, "Mrs. Robinson, if there's ever a way I can return the kindness you showed me, I want you to ask. Don't be shy about it. Life doesn't hand us many lifelines. When one comes along, you ought to take it." Angela's instinct was to refuse. Pride had been her armor for so long. But as she met his steady gaze, Patricia's words from the porch echoed again, "You are drowning." She straightened her shoulders, the memory of Thomas's promise pulsing in her chest. "Thank you, Mr. Carter," she said softly. "I'll keep that in mind." When she left the suite, the folder of bank papers felt a little lighter in her bag. For the first time in weeks, Angela Robinson wondered if maybe, just maybe, she wasn't swimming alone anymore. Angela returned home that evening with a strange mix of fatigue and electricity buzzing inside her. The day's chores at the hotel had left her body heavy, but her mind was alive in a way it hadn't been for weeks. Mr. William Carter's words followed her all the way down Peachtree, through the cracked sidewalks of her neighborhood, right up the steps of her porch. Life doesn't hand us many lifelines. When one comes along, you ought to take it. She unlocked the front door and found Jasmine at the kitchen table with her textbooks spread out like a fan of ambition. A mug of chamomile steamed beside her. Jasmine glanced up. "How was work, Mama?" Angela paused, leaning against the doorframe, searching for the right words. Work was work, but something happened. Jasmine put her pen down. "Good something or bad something?" Angela pulled out the chair across from her and sat. "A man I helped at the hotel. He collapsed in one of the suites. I called for help, stayed with him until the paramedics came. Today he asked to see me, thanked me." "That's good, Mama." Angela hesitated. "It wasn't just thanks. He said if I ever needed help, I should ask." Jasmine's eyes lit, curiosity sharpening her face. "Mama, who is he?" "William Carter." Angela spoke the name as if it might evaporate in the air. "The businessman owns Carter Holdings." Jasmine's mouth dropped. "Mama, he's like on the cover of magazines, that's huge." Angela shook her head, uncomfortable with the idea of it. "I don't know, baby. I'm not used to asking anyone for anything. Your daddy and we made it a rule if we couldn't pay for it, we didn't deserve it." Jasmine leaned forward, her eyes fierce. "Mama, Daddy didn't have to raise 2 kids alone. He didn't have Patricia breathing down his neck, or Marcus forging signatures. You've carried too much by yourself. Maybe this is God's way of sending you a hand." Angela fell silent. Jasmine's words rang with the kind of clarity only the young, who have not yet grown tired from the world's weight, could muster. The next morning, Angela dialed the number Mr. Carter had written on the back of his business card. Her hand shook as she held the phone. When his assistant answered, the call was transferred almost immediately. "Mrs. Robinson," William's voice came through, warm but firm. "I'm glad you called." Angela cleared her throat. "I wouldn't accept. My family is in trouble. My son, he took out a loan against the house with my name, but I never signed those papers. I'm afraid I'll lose the only thing I have." For a moment, silence hummed on the other end. Then William spoke, measured but direct. "Forgery, that's serious. Have you consulted a lawyer?" Angela gave a small, embarrassed laugh. "Lawyers are for people with money. I can barely pay the water bill." "Then let me arrange it," William said without hesitation. "I have a colleague, Mr. Leonard Hayes, one of the best property attorneys in the state. He owes me a favor, and he will meet with you this week. No fee. Consider it my repayment for what you did for me." Angela's mouth went dry. She wanted to refuse to protect her pride, but the thought of Patricia waving bank papers in her face made refusal feel like another chain around her neck. "Thank you, Mr. Carter," she said softly. "I don't know how to." "You don't need to," he interrupted gently. "Just show up with every document you have. Let the law speak where family has failed you." 2 days later, Angela and Jasmine sat in the polished oak office of Leonard Hayes. The man himself was silver-haired, with eyes sharp as glass and a handshake that conveyed decades of courtroom victories. "Mrs. Robinson," he said, adjusting his glasses as Angela laid the folder of documents on the desk. "Let's see what we're dealing with." Angela watched him scan through the pages, the original deed, the loan papers, the forged signature. Each time his brow furrowed, a stone of hope dropped into Angela's chest. Finally, he leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Well," he said, "you were right to come. This is fraud, and it's more serious than you may realize. The bank has acted on a faulty document. They may have grounds to pursue Marcus, but not you, if we can prove this signature isn't yours. Which, from what I see, is clear." Angela clasped her hands tightly in her lap. "But can they still take the house?" Mr. Hayes shook his head. "Not if we move quickly. I'll file an emergency injunction to freeze foreclosure proceedings until we establish the forgery. I'll also notify the district attorney's office. Whoever facilitated this loan without proper verification could be in deep trouble. But first, tell me, Mrs. Robinson, do you trust your son to stand with you or against you?" The question struck her like cold water. She looked at Jasmine, whose lips pressed thin, waiting. Angela lowered her gaze. "I don't know anymore." Mr. Hayes sighed. "Then prepare yourself for both. But remember, the law isn't about loyalty, it's about proof, and right now the proof favors you." That night, as Angela and Jasmine walked home, the city lights glowed in soft halos against the dusk. Angela felt a fragile kind of courage budding inside her. For the first time since the letter arrived, she had a plan, steps, papers, people on her side. Still, she couldn't quiet the ache in her chest. Marcus's face haunted her, the anger at the dinner table, the shame in his eyes when she held up the letter. She had fought so long to give him a future, and now it was his choices threatening to steal hers. At the corner before their street, Jasmine slipped her arm through Angela's. "Mama," she said, "I know Marcus messed up, but don't give up on him. Please, you always say family is worth saving." Angela squeezed her daughter's hand. "Family is worth saving, baby. But sometimes you have to save yourself first, or there'll be nothing left to give." As they turned onto Peachtree Lane, Angela lifted her chin. Patricia's voice, Marcus's mistakes, the bank's threats, all of it swirled like storm clouds at the edge of her life. But somewhere behind those clouds was a sliver of sunlight. For the first time in a long time, Angela Robinson felt the warmth of it on her skin. The courthouse in downtown Atlanta was a building Angela had passed countless times, always from a distance. Its columns stretched tall and unyielding, like gatekeepers of a world she never believed she would enter. To her, courthouses had always belonged to other people, landlords, politicians, businessmen in crisp suits, never widows in thrift store dresses. Yet here she was, walking up the granite steps with Jasmine at her side and Mr. Hayes leading the way. Her navy church dress, pressed as neatly as she could manage, suddenly felt too thin against the cold morning wind. The file folder clutched in her hands was her armor. Inside, the air was colder still, humming with the shuffle of papers and the metallic echo of heels on tile. Angela sat on a wooden bench while Hayes checked them in. Her heart beat so loud she wondered if others could hear it. "Breathe, Mama," Jasmine whispered, squeezing her hand. "You've already done the hardest part coming here." Angela nodded, though her throat was dry. She reminded herself of William Carter's words, "Let the law speak where family has failed you." The hearing room was smaller than Angela imagined, but the weight inside it was enormous. Patricia was already there, seated with two of Thomas's cousins. They whispered to one another, glancing at Angela with thin smiles that weren't smiles at all, and then Marcus entered. Angela's breath caught. He wore a suit that didn't quite fit, his tie askew. His eyes flicked toward her, and for a split second, the boy she raised flickered through the man who stood before her. But shame shadowed his face, and he turned quickly to sit with Patricia. The sight cut Angela deeper than any blade. Judge Williams, a stern woman with steel-gray hair, entered and the room rose. The proceedings began. Hayes spoke first. His voice was calm, deliberate, like a man drawing careful lines on a map. He presented the deed, Angela's verified signature, the loan documents with the forged one. He described Angela's history with the property, her payments, her role as sole maintainer since Thomas's death. He pointed to the inconsistencies in the bank's paperwork, the absence of required verification. At one point, he handed Angela's folder of evidence to the clerk. Angela watched the papers move from her hands into the court's keeping. It felt like passing her heart to a stranger. When Patricia's attorney rose, the tone shifted. He spoke of Marcus's ambition, of opportunities squandered, of how Angela had failed to guide her son's choices responsibly. Patricia nodded along, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, playing the part of a grieving sister who only wanted to protect her late brother's legacy. Angela's hands tightened into fists on her lap. She wanted to stand, to shout that Patricia hadn't lifted a finger when Thomas died, hadn't bought a single bag of groceries when the cupboards were bare. But she forced herself still. Let the law speak. Then Marcus was called. He walked to the stand with a stiffness Angela recognized from childhood, the same stiffness he wore when he knew he was in trouble. His voice wavered as he admitted to signing the papers. "Did your mother, Angela Robinson, consent to this loan?" Hayes asked. Marcus's eyes darted toward Patricia, then to the judge, and finally, hesitantly, to Angela. For a moment, the silence stretched so thin it might snap. "No," he said at last. His voice was low, ashamed. "She didn't." Angela closed her eyes. Relief and sorrow flooded together, leaving her trembling. Patricia's face twisted in fury, but the damage was done. When the hearing recessed, Angela stepped into the hallway, leaning against the cool marble wall. Jasmine stood beside her, silent but steady. Patricia stormed out moments later, heels clacking like gunfire. She stopped in front of Angela. "You think this is over? You embarrassed your son. You dragged family through the mud. Don't expect us to stand by you when the bank comes knocking again." Angela met her gaze, the exhaustion in her bones burning into resolve. "Family doesn't try to steal from family," she said evenly. "And if you think shame will keep me quiet, you've forgotten who I am." Patricia scoffed, muttered something under her breath, and swept away. Marcus lingered in the doorway, staring at the floor. Angela's heart ached to reach for him, to gather him into her arms like she once did after scraped knees and bad dreams. But she stood still, waiting. Finally, he lifted his head. His eyes were wet. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered. Angela's throat tightened. "We'll talk later," she said softly. "Right now, just do better than this." He nodded once and walked away, shoulders slumped. Back inside, Judge Williams returned with her decision. She ordered an immediate freeze on foreclosure proceedings, pending full investigation of the forgery. The court acknowledged Angela Robinson as primary owner of the house. Angela exhaled a breath she felt she'd been holding since Thomas's funeral. For the first time in years, the weight shifted from her shoulders, even if just slightly. As the gavel struck, Hayes leaned toward her. "This is only the beginning," he said, "but you've won an important battle today." Angela nodded, tears welling. "Thank you." When she walked out of the courthouse into the noon sunlight, it felt different on her skin. Brighter, warmer, as though it had been waiting for her to step out from under the shadow all along. The courthouse victory should have felt like triumph, but Angela carried it home like a burden. That evening, the house seemed both safer and lonelier. She walked through the rooms, trailing her hand along the walls as though to remind herself the place still belonged to her. The mortgage papers might have been frozen, but her heart was anything but. Jasmine tried to lighten the mood. She reheated leftover chicken, set the table with mismatched plates, and put gospel music low on the radio. "We should celebrate, Mama," she said softly. "The judge saw the truth. We kept the house." Angela smiled faintly, but the taste of victory was bittersweet. "We won today," she murmured. But battles have a way of circling back. It wasn't the bank or Patricia's threats that haunted her most. It was Marcus. His face on the stand, his voice breaking as he confessed. The boy who had once slipped daisy chains into her hair now looked at her like she was both savior and enemy. Late that night, she heard the creak of the front door. Marcus stepped inside. His shoulders drooped as if he carried an invisible pack of stones. He smelled faintly of whiskey. "Marcus," Angela said, rising from the couch. He avoided her eyes. "I came to talk." She gestured toward the sofa. He sank into it, running his hands through his hair. The silence stretched, heavy until he finally spoke. "I didn't mean for it to get this far, Mom. I thought if the investment worked out, you'd never have to clean another hotel room again. I thought I could fix everything." His voice cracked on the last word. Angela sat beside him, searching his face. "Son, you don't fix broken things by breaking them more. You don't save family by lying to them." He clenched his fists. "You think I wanted to lie? You think I wanted to stand in that courtroom today and admit I forged your name? I've never been so humiliated in my life." Angela's breath caught. "Humiliated?" "Yes," Marcus snapped. His voice was raw, jagged. "Everyone looking at me like I'm some criminal, like I'm worthless. Even you, especially you." Angela's eyes welled. "Marcus, I didn't put you on that stand. Your choices did." He shook his head, anger rising like a tide. "You don't get it, Mom. You never believe in me. Every idea I bring, you shoot down. You've already decided I'll fail before I start. How am I supposed to prove myself if you don't give me room to try?" Angela's voice trembled. "You want room to try, then get your own ground to stand on. You don't gamble with your father's house, with your sister's future, with my name." She pressed a hand to her chest. "Do you know what it felt like, seeing that forged signature? Like you erased me." Marcus flinched, his eyes shining with tears he refused to shed. "I just wanted to be more than the poor kid everyone pities. I wanted to give you something back." "You already gave me everything," Angela whispered. "The day you were born, the day you took your first step. Every morning I woke up and kept going. It was for you and Jasmine. You don't need to buy me back with a house or a business deal. I only ever wanted you safe." For a moment, his expression wavered. The boy inside the man surfaced. Then pride dragged the mask back over his face. He stood abruptly. "Maybe I need to figure this out on my own," he muttered. "I'll crash at a friend's place for a while." Angela's heart lurched. "Marcus, please," he shook his head. "You don't trust me, and I can't stand in this house feeling like a failure." With that, he walked out again. The door closed with a thud that echoed through Angela's chest. Jasmine came down the stairs, her face pale. "Mama," Angela turned, her voice breaking. "He left." Jasmine wrapped her arms around her, both of them trembling in the quiet. Angela pressed her cheek to her daughter's hair, the scent of shampoo mixing with her own tears. "I don't know how to reach him anymore," Angela whispered. "I don't know if he even wants me to." Jasmine's voice was steady, though her eyes were wet. "He's lost, Mama, but sometimes people have to get lost before they want to be found." Angela clung to her daughter, her heart aching with a mix of love and sorrow. She had fought the bank, she had stood up to Patricia, but this was the battle she couldn't map out in court filings and evidence. This was the battlefield of family, the kind where victories were small and fragile and defeats cut deepest of all. As the night deepened, Angela prayed quietly, not for herself, not even for the house, but for her son, that he would remember where home truly was. The days after Marcus left were long and quiet. The house felt emptier than it ever had, even in the raw days after Thomas's funeral. Angela moved from room to room like a caretaker in a museum of her own life, straightening a curtain, wiping a counter, folding the same blanket twice. She told herself the silence was rest, but it felt more like waiting. Jasmine noticed, of course. She tried to fill the void with conversation, with stories from the bookstore, with dreams about college. But Angela could see the weight pressing on her daughter, too. Jasmine laughed, but her laughter cracked at the edges like glass that had been mended one too many times. It was on a Wednesday morning, while Angela was scrubbing the hotel lobby floor, that William Carter returned. She hadn't expected to see him again. But when the polished leather shoes stopped beside her bucket and the familiar voice said, "Mrs. Robinson?" She looked up, startled. He was dressed simply this time, dark slacks, a light blue shirt, no tie. Less like a magnate, more like a man. His smile was calm, but there was a seriousness in his eyes. "Mr. Carter," Angela said quickly, standing, embarrassed by the mop in her hand. He shook his head. "Please don't stand on ceremony with me. I came to ask you something." Angela blinked. "Me?" He nodded. "You see, I run a foundation. We help single mothers, widows, women who have been holding their families together against impossible odds. I couldn't stop thinking about you after we met, about how much strength you've carried." He paused, lowering his voice. "I think your story could inspire others. I want you to join us, not as someone we help, but as someone who helps us help others." Angela's breath caught. "I'm no speaker, Mr. Carter. I'm just a hotel maid trying to keep a roof over my daughter's head." "That's exactly why," he said softly. "Because you are real. Because you've lived the struggle so many women are still living. They don't need another suit telling them how to succeed. They need someone like you, who knows what it means to be up at 4 a.m., making sandwiches before cleaning rooms until midnight." Angela felt her throat tighten. She thought of the nights she'd prayed with blistered hands, asking only for strength to make it through another day. The idea that those very struggles could be of value to someone else was foreign, and yet it stirred something warm in her chest. "What would you have me do?" she asked cautiously. "Come to a community meeting this Saturday," William said. "Tell your story, meet the women, and if it feels right, maybe take on a role with us. Part-time, flexible, we could use your heart." Angela hesitated, glancing at her hands, still damp from cleaning solution, hands that had known labor but never leadership. "I'll think about it," she said quietly. William smiled, not pressing further. "That's all I ask, just think." He slipped her a card with the address. "And Mrs. Robinson, sometimes help isn't charity. Sometimes it's a chance to give others what you've already been giving all your life." Saturday came. Angela almost didn't go. She stood in her bedroom, smoothing the navy dress for the third time, heart pounding. Jasmine peeked in. "You look beautiful, Mama," she said. Angela gave a nervous laugh. "Beautiful isn't what they need. They need someone who knows how to keep lights on with $5 and faith." "Then you're perfect," Jasmine said, slipping her arm around her. "Go, tell them." So Angela went. The meeting was held in the basement of a downtown church, filled with rows of folding chairs. Women of all ages sat in clusters, some with babies on their laps, others with eyes weary but hopeful. A volunteer offered Angela a seat in the front, but William spotted her and waved her up. "Friends," he said to the room, "this is Angela Robinson. She has a story worth hearing." Angela's knees shook as she stood. She hadn't prepared a speech. She only had her truth. "My name is Angela," she began, her voice trembling. "I'm 52 years old. I'm a widow. I've raised 2 children on my own, and I've worked almost every job you can imagine, cleaning offices, frying cafeteria food, scrubbing hotel rooms. For a long time, I thought the only way I could show love was by working myself to the bone." She paused, swallowing. The women watched, listening. "But love," she continued, "isn't just what you do for people. It's also what you teach them about their worth. I forgot that for a while. I let my son's mistakes nearly cost us our home, and I blamed myself. But I'm learning now you can't save people by losing yourself. You have to protect what God gave you so you can keep giving." Silence filled the room, thick and reverent. Then a woman in the second row began to clap. Another joined. Soon the whole basement was alive with applause. Angela's face flushed, but she smiled through tears. For the first time in years, her story wasn't a secret burden, it was a gift. After the meeting, several women came up to hug her. They shared their own stories: evictions, abusive marriages, children lost to the streets. Angela listened, her heart wide open. She realized she wasn't alone. None of them were. Later, William approached. "You were remarkable," he said. Angela shook her head. "I just spoke plain." "That's what makes it remarkable," he replied. "We'd like to bring you on board, outreach coordinator. You'd be visiting homes, speaking with women, connecting them to resources. It pays better than the hotel, and it honors what you've lived." Angela's hands trembled as she held the offer. For so long, her life had been about survival. Could it really shift toward purpose? She thought of Patricia, of Marcus, of all the voices that had told her she was nothing more than a burden. Then she thought of the women who had clapped for her, who had looked at her with gratitude. Angela lifted her chin. "Yes," she said softly, "I'll do it." And in that basement, surrounded by strangers who suddenly felt like sisters, Angela Robinson took her first step not as a maid, not as a widow, not as a burden, but as a woman rising. The new job at William Carter's Foundation gave Angela a sense of rhythm she hadn't felt in years. Each morning, instead of trudging to the hotel with her mop bucket and aching back, she walked into a modest office with bright windows and the sound of women's voices rising like a choir. Some came with babies, some with scars visible and invisible, all carrying stories that weighed as heavy as her own once had. Angela listened, counseled, guided. The work filled her days, but the nights remained hollow. Marcus's absence was a silence she couldn't scrub away. Jasmine tried to keep her spirits lifted, often coming home from the bookstore with funny anecdotes or small gifts. But every time the front door creaked, Angela's heart leapt with the hope it might be her son returning. Each time, it wasn't. Weeks passed. Then one rainy evening in October, the door did open, and this time it was him. Marcus stood in the doorway soaked through, his clothes disheveled, his face gaunt. His once bold shoulders sagged, and his eyes, once blazing with pride and ambition, were glassy and red-rimmed. He carried no suitcase, no swagger, only a hollowness that seemed to echo into the room with him. "Marcus," Angela whispered, rising from the couch. He hesitated at the threshold like a child caught sneaking home past curfew. "Mama," his voice broke. Angela rushed forward and pulled him in before the rain could claim him again. He stood in her arms, stiff at first, then collapsed against her, his body shaking with sobs. For a moment, she was no longer holding a grown man but the boy who once scraped his knees and ran crying into her lap. Jasmine came down the stairs slowly, her eyes wide. "Marcus," she breathed. He looked up, ashamed, unable to meet her gaze. "I'm sorry," he choked. "I've messed up worse than you know." Angela guided him to the couch, sat him down, and pressed a towel into his trembling hands. "Tell me," she said gently. Marcus swallowed hard. "The people I borrowed money from, they weren't just bankers. Some of them were private lenders, shady ones. When the real estate deal collapsed, they wanted their money back. I tried to keep up, taking odd jobs, borrowing from friends, but it just got worse. Last week they came after me, took my car. I've been sleeping on couches, sometimes on the street. I got nowhere left to go." His words spilled out like water breaking through a dam. Each confession stabbed Angela's heart, but she kept her face calm. Jasmine sank onto the chair across from him, tears brimming. "Marcus, why didn't you tell us?" He covered his face with his hands. "Because I was supposed to take care of you. Of Mom. Dad's gone, and I was supposed to be the man of the house. But all I've done is make you hate me." Angela reached over and gently pulled his hands away from his face. "Look at me, Marcus." Reluctantly, he lifted his eyes to hers. She saw the brokenness there, the shame, the regret, and beneath it all, the boy who had once believed he could change the world. "You think I hate you?" Angela said softly, her voice trembling. "I could never hate you. "You are my son, my blood, but I can't carry your choices for you. You've got to learn that love doesn't mean letting someone drag you down into the pit. Love sometimes means standing firm while the other climbs out." Marcus's lips quivered. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." Angela cupped his face with both hands, her thumbs brushing away his tears. "None of us deserve grace, baby, but it's given anyway. That's what keeps families alive." For the first time in years, Marcus let the walls crumble. He wept openly, his shoulders shaking. Jasmine moved to his side, wrapping her arms around him too. The three of them clung together, mother, son, daughter, bound not by perfection, but by survival, by love that had been bruised but not broken. The storm outside pounded harder against the windows, but inside something shifted. Angela felt it in her bones, the moment where pain and forgiveness collide, where the cracks in a family become the very lines that hold it together. Later that night, Marcus sat at the kitchen table sipping warm tea Jasmine had made. He looked smaller, younger, his voice quieter. "Mama, what do I do now?" Angela sat across from him, steady, though tears still lingered in her eyes. "First, you stop running, you face what you've done. You take whatever help is offered and you rebuild, slowly, honestly, one brick at a time." Marcus nodded, his gaze fixed on the chipped edge of his mug. "I'll do better, I swear." Angela reached across the table, laying her hand over his. "I believe you, but belief isn't words anymore, Marcus. It's action. Tomorrow you'll come with me to the foundation. You'll volunteer, meet the women there, hear their stories. You'll see that redemption is possible, but it starts with humility." His eyes flicked up, uncertain but hopeful. "You'd let me." Angela smiled faintly. "You're my son, I'll always let you try again. But this time, Marcus, no shortcuts, no easy money, just truth." He nodded again, tears threatening to spill once more. That night, when Angela finally lay in bed, she felt something she hadn't in months: relief. Not because everything was fixed, it wasn't, but because her son was back under her roof, broken enough to be rebuilt. She whispered into the darkness as if Thomas might hear her. "He's home. He's still ours. And maybe, just maybe, we'll make it." And for the first time in a long while, Angela Robinson closed her eyes and slept with peace. The weeks that followed Marcus's return were not easy, but they were different. For the first time in years, Angela felt that the air in the house was not heavy with secrets. Marcus rose early each morning, sometimes groaning, sometimes dragging his feet, but he went with her to the foundation office just as she had said he would. At first, he stood awkwardly by the doorway while Angela met with women who carried their own burdens. But slowly, almost against his will, Marcus began to listen. He heard stories of eviction, of jobs lost, of sons taken by the streets, and something in him softened. He recognized himself in the desperation, the hunger to prove worth, the shame of mistakes too big to erase. One morning, William Carter stopped by the office. He shook Marcus's hand firmly. "Your mother saved me," he said, his eyes twinkling. "Don't forget that you come from strong stock." Marcus's shoulders squared just a little. For the first time, he didn't look like a man drowning. He looked like a man trying to learn how to swim. Angela thrived in her new role. She was no longer just a housekeeper of hotel rooms. She was a keeper of stories, a voice of encouragement, a guide for women who had been told too many times they were not enough. She spoke at meetings, at churches, even at a local college seminar. Her words weren't polished, but they were real, and that made all the difference. Jasmine blossomed too. With her mother's new stability, she was able to focus on her studies, applying for scholarships with renewed hope. The day her acceptance letter from Spelman arrived, Angela cried tears that soaked the page. "Go, baby," she whispered, hugging Jasmine tight. "Go where God calls you, don't be afraid." The house on Peachtree Lane was no longer a place of fear. The porch still sagged, the paint still peeled, but it was a home again, filled with laughter some nights, with quiet determination others. Patricia stopped coming by after the court's decision was finalized. The phone calls from the family dwindled. Angela realized something profound. Sometimes the people you lose are the very ones you needed to release. Marcus began working part-time with the foundation, helping with transportation and odd jobs. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. Each paycheck he brought home felt like a small redemption. Angela watched him carefully, ready to hold him accountable, but she also let herself hope. On a bright spring morning, Angela stood on the small stage at the Foundation's annual banquet. She looked out at the crowd, women, children, donors, neighbors, and felt a wave of gratitude so strong it nearly stole her voice. She spoke of her journey, of Thomas's death, of the nights spent scrubbing floors, of Marcus's mistakes and her own fear of losing everything, of William Carter's kindness, and of the rebirth that came not from money or luck, but from courage, community, and the decision to believe in herself again. When she finished, the applause was thunderous. But what mattered most to Angela was seeing Jasmine smiling through tears in the front row and Marcus clapping hard, his chin lifted with pride. That night, after the banquet, Angela sat on the porch with a cup of tea. The air smelled of magnolias, and the city hummed softly in the distance. She thought of Thomas, of the promise he had made that the house would always be theirs. She thought of the battles she had fought, the storms she had weathered, and the peace she now felt. For the first time in decades, Angela Robinson was not merely surviving. She was living. And as she leaned back, closing her eyes, she whispered, "Thank you. Dear friends, thank you for walking with me through this story." Life is never without its trials, betrayal, hardship, loss, but it is also never without the possibility of hope and rebirth. My wish for you is simple. May your homes be filled with peace, may your families be bound by love stronger than pride, and may your hearts always find the strength to rise again after every fall. Take care of your health, cherish your loved ones, and remember, you are worth more than the world sometimes tells you. With gratitude, I wish you and your families happiness and blessings always.